Bujuani, Fawn Pochel, Indigenous, Chicago Dunjaba, Anikoa Dundum. My name is Fawn Pochel. I am First Nations OG Cree and Beaver Clan. Um, I am currently the education coordinator at the American Indian Center, as well as a member of the Shy Nations Youth Council, and currently helping to develop out the Northwest Portage Walking Museum, which will be end marked by the first two Indigenous mounds built in North America since the processes of colonization.
Do you mind saying hi to the kids?
Hello.
Okay.
First, I would like to start off by saying that my explanations are going to be centered from my worldview and my own personal and tribal perspectives. But when we're talking about Indigenous mounds, we're talking about mounds built by Native people who have kinship and ancestral connections to the lands that we are currently occupying. Um, Indigenous mound systems have spread across much of North America and the Western Hemisphere. In particularly, we're focused on kind of the Mississippian mounds, which are built in the region that Chicago is, modern day Chicago, resides in. So, effigy mounds are primarily mounds that are built to symbolize certain cultural teachings depending on who built the mounds. When I say Mississippian, I am talking about a vast network of tribal folks who now make up hundreds of tribal sovereign nations. When we think about Mississippian period or so-called Mississippian civilization, we're really talking about 7 different language bases. And for example, one of those language bases would be Algonquin, which now is turned into dozens of different tribal nations that span over not only the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe people, but also the Potawatomi, the Menominee, and Odawa. So, from my understanding, there are different types of mounds. And the ones that we're working on with the Northwest Portage Walking Museum are going to be effigy mounds symbolic of serpents. So the mounds that you guys are going to visit, the site that the mounds will be on that you all are going to visit, is going to be in English the twin mounds, and it's going to be representative of a serpent coming in or out of the water system. On the other end of the Northwest Portage Walking Museum, which will be by the North Channel of the Chicago River, it is going to be another symbol of a serpent coming in or out of hibernation.
So there's 2.
So there will be 2 mounds. We're only breaking down ground on the first one currently. So the meanings are going to be different for the different ways that effigy mounds are being interacted with. Because my tribal nation has been forcibly removed from this region, our interaction with mounds are primarily through planting and wayfinding, mounds being a marker of knowing where you're located for travel sites. When we think about effigy mounds in modern context, they often depict a certain type of relationship to the land, and within the structure that they're developed to represent, there is a base teaching. So I'll talk about the modern day mounds, um, and the reason that a serpent was chosen. The serpent for different tribal entities mean different things. The meaning behind why we chose it was because the serpent represents the duality between aquatic life and land life. But for other tribal entities, for instance, the Ho Chunk serpents, clan systems represent the outermost clan, which also fits into the larger picture of the Northwest Portage Walking Museum, that these are the end markers.
At the end of the trail.
At the end of each trail. Yeah. Yeah. So when we think about the different perspectives of how mounds are interpreted by folks from Western societies and folks from indigenous societies, we have to take into consideration the history of colonization in the Western Hemisphere. So, if we were to say that Native people built these mounds from and back that up by Western education, then we have to reassess how we see the United States. In part, we have to be more honest about the history of the United States, built on the eradication and exploitation and the genocide of indigenous people. Where we're living in a society that's not able to admit that to themselves yet. So, by saying that the mounds were built by ancient civilizations who no longer exist, or by saying that mounds were built by European settlers who were in the Americas before Christopher Columbus, we are continuing the process of dehumanizing Native people, and centering Indigenous people as primitive and unable to have complex structures and societies within a developed civilization. In addition, when we're working with Indigenous scholars to utilize Western ways of thinking and knowledge systems to back up evidence of oration or oral history and tribal histories, we're reinforcing that not all things written are true, and kind of using our knowledge systems as a base of theory building and overlaying Western knowledge systems to reinforce that helps us to refocus how people view indigenous civilizations and modern day cultures. So when we're refocusing on understanding the complexity of indigenous societies, we often fall short of doing so in educational institutions, because by acknowledging Native people have complex systems of societal structures, we have to reevaluate how we believe ourselves to be as Americans. We have to reevaluate Columbus discovering America and what the myth of discovery perpetuates. We also have to reevaluate the mythology behind the United States being the land of immigrants and built by immigrants, because we have exploited the indigenous intellectual properties and contributions that indigenous people have made in order to develop the modern day society that we all live in. We should recognize that the Chicagoland area is the homelands of over a dozen different tribal nations who continue to trade, occupy, and conduct ceremonies. So when we're thinking about what do these mounds mean, it really speaks to the ideology of Indigenous futurism. So Indigenous futurism means recognizing our ancestral past and knowledge systems, building our modern day networks, and perpetuating traditional practices and acts of being for future generations. So when we're talking about building these mounds as an act of Indigenous futurism, we're talking about setting the stage for not only us to recognize that there are modern day people still thriving in this region, but also setting the stage that we will continue to exist in the future, and debunking the mythology that Indigenous people are extinct, and kind of being a contrasting piece of art, interactive art, towards all of the symbolism that is embedded within the city of Chicago and the state of Illinois that acts to erase Native people. And erasure happens in a lot of different ways. Erasure happens with the way that we think about how Chicago was founded, and giving the idea that Chicago was founded by Jean-Baptiste Dusabo, without recognizing the only reason he was able to settle and become the first capitalist of Chicago is because he was married to a Potawatomi woman. And kind of confronting all of the settler history with a critical lens, asking the question of why Chicago has developed into the urban megacenter of the Midwest, and kind of thinking about the ways that we even interact with the environment of Chicago and the open green spaces here in Chicago. A lot of the forest preserve lands are unceded territory and were land claims given to individual Native families. And now the forest preserve have become public common areas in order for people to gather. Because they are unsucceeded territories, they're able to be utilized as some of the only remnants of indigenous landscape that we still have in the state of Illinois. Building these mounds perpetuates the fact that within the state of Illinois is the second most manipulated landscape in the United States, the first being the state of Iowa. And
So manipulated means transformed, artificially transformed.
yes. So kind of understanding how not only the erasure of indigenous people in the state of Illinois, in the city of Chicago, has perpetuated urbanization, but has also perpetuated environmental degradation, is embedded into developing these two earthworks that are going to hopefully forever represent the fact that indigenous people refuse to be removed from the city of Chicago, and that we have always maintained some presence here.
And we're going to see, I guess we'll see what we're going to see, but we're going to, is there going to be support in explaining whatever events and cultural aspects to the inauguration?
Yes, so there will be an opening where folks from the Native community are going to talk. You are going to hear from the director of the American Indian Center. She will be doing a land acknowledgement and kind of focusing more on the tribal nations who have had treaty rights in the city of Chicago during the colonization process. You'll be hearing from the lead artist who developed the ideas for this mound, Santiago X, who is both Chamorro, indigenous from the islands of Guam, and as well as Cochetta, who now reside in Louisiana and are from a mound building ancestry. And then you will be hearing from other indigenous folks while we are doing planting in the forest preserve area, and you'll be able to learn a little bit more about indigenous plants that are being not reintroduced into the space and cared for by the indigenous community. There'll be opportunities to canoe the Des Plaines River and kind of understand the relationship that the Des Plaines River has to this area being a focal point for trade. Yeah.
Any final thoughts?
Oh, I think I'm good. Okay.